Great. So, welcome everyone. Today's talk will be about getting hands-on with PHP 7.3. How many of you have tried it actually? 7.2? 7.1? 5.3? All right. Awesome. How many of you still have it in production? Cool. So I don't know how many of you are aware of PHP 7's release cycle. Not so much. So the new concept since 7.0 is that at the end of each and every year there will be a minor version bump, which is followed by a major one every 5 to 6 years roughly. We will see if they meet that with 8.0. That being said, 7.3 is very much well in the works already. And the good thing about it is that PHP is kind of like a halfway loved, halfway hated programming language, if we can say that. And there are reasons for that. Why do we like it? So the very first thing is that it's easily accessible. It's available on nearly every Linux distribution. You can install it on Windows, Mac, whatever you want, really. It's easy to prototype in it. You quickly hack it together. You don't even need to follow like object-oriented programming. Just shove it together and it's ready to go. It's a general purpose language. So it means that really whatever you want to do in it, you can do it. It may not do it well, but it will do it at the end of the day. Most of the time. Most of the time. It has a large open source community, which kind of ensures that it will constantly be in development for the foreseeable future, right? Most of the time, it has good documentation. Almost always, if someone thinks that PHP's documentation is good, just look up the Cairo library's documentation. You will find some interesting stuff there. And it's almost always consistent. So I am more than happy to have a WOT talk about it at some later stage with some demos, but it's almost always there. Sorry, what was that? Yeah, well, yeah. Let's put it this way. So, because it has a large open source community and it's a widely used language, it saw a lot of releases during the last 2 years, much more than any other programming language like Java and whatnot. It had 5.6 back in 2014. It had 7.0, it had 7.1, then 7.2. And 7.3's expected release will be somewhere around the 1st of December, which is roughly a bit over half a year away. Now, how many of you actually do forward compatibility planning with programming language version upgrades and write polyfills so that when you upgrade to a new PHP version, it won't break? Yeah, yeah. Well, very few people does, but that's why you may still have 5.4 and 5.5 in production. Because you just don't do it, and then the new PHP version hits, and suddenly you find yourself in a position where if you upgrade your monolithic / microservice stack, suddenly it will work. That being said, since 7.3 is already in the works for quite some time now, there are some new features that I would like to showcase with like actual code and whatnot. Just a second. So as you can see on the screen, let me zoom in. As you can see now on the screen, these are 2 Docker containers. If I do a PHP -v on the bottom one, you will see that it's a 7.3 dev. So this uses 7.3 compiled from source. The top one is a 7.2.4 container. So the demo today will be about me showing you some of the new features and how do they behave in 5.2 and how do they behave in 5.3. So how many of you are familiar with the new features coming up? 7.3. Okay, good, awesome. That's good actually, because that means that at least you are following the news. When since it is still a work in progress as such, new features are expected literally as we speak. The very first thing that I would like to show is pretty much, just a second, it's just the resolution is a little bit shaky. The very first thing is count. So how many of you had issues with calling the count function on non-arrays and non-countable objects? And yeah, kinda. So right now, if you want to work around that in PHP 7.2, you have to write a boilerplate, namely that you either need to check if a variable is an array, or you need to check if it's an object, and it implements the countable interface. Now that's a lot of boilerplate. PHP 7.3 actually implemented a new function for that, and that new function is the isCountable.
Amazing.
Yeah, we only had to wait 7.5 years for that. Large open source community, right? Right in the middle. But now we have isCountable. So that means that if you have an array, or if you have an array object, or whatever you want, you don't need that extreme boilerplate that you had in 7.2 back in time, which looked kind of like that. And since no one ever extracted it into a single function, it always looks like this in like 100 places in the code. Suddenly it starts working. As you can see here in the itself, if I do the bottom one is 7.3, it works pretty much. So this countable is there. The second thing is the new doc, syntax changes. How many of you use it?
edoc.
edoc, udoc, you name it.
Is this the ending of the udoc?
Not just that, but also that now you can write extra characters after the closing tag. How cool is that?
And indenting.
Yeah, so there are two features in this regard that got introduced in the here doc support. This is how it looked like back in PHP 7.2, that when you started using it, then you were able to open it with a tag, then close it with a tag, but as soon as you added anything after the end of the closing tag on the same line, it suddenly broke. So what happens is that if I run it on the PHP 7.2 environment, it works, right? As expected. Now, if I suddenly remove that, even PHP Storm complains about it. But if I try to run it, then suddenly it will throw this kind of error, which might be a bit, expected really, but it really shouldn't be there, because why can't we close the array there, right? Also, another problem is that if I try to write like, this is an array, right? I just want to add more values to it. Why can't I do like that? Still, same issue, pretty much. Unexpected, and there you go. 7.3 to the rescue, though, because you have the same syntax and it will work. So the existing functionality doesn't break whatsoever. As you can see. But there are two new features. One is that I can just keep adding values to it. Although PHP Storm still doesn't recognize it properly because it doesn't really have 7.3 support yet. But if I run it, it will just work. Also, another interesting bit is the indentation, as it was flagged by the audience, that technically this is something that has not been supported yet, irrespective of what kind of syntax you use, that depending on how many white spaces do you hit in front of the closing tag, that exact amount of white space will be cut off from the beginning of each and every inserted line. So as you can see here, the indentation was preserved, that's 4 spaces. But if I run it now, it's only 2 spaces. Just something to be mindful of when you are upgrading.
Great for putting SQL code.
Yeah, well, you really shouldn't do that. Anyways, although there are legitimate use cases for SQL factories in your code, if you are writing an analytical software, but that actually shouldn't be written in PHP anyway. So, yeah. The baseline statement was that it's a flexible language and you can write nearly everything in it, which does not mean that you should. So there's a slight difference. Alrighty, so next feature that got implemented is that how many of you use array syntax and add a comma after the last element?
Yeah.
Oh, that's always a shaky one. And who doesn't?
That's horrible.
Oh, okay, then what the others do? Like not coding in PHP? What are you doing here? Alrighty. That being said, the next feature that got implemented in PHP 7.3 is that in function calls, very important, not in function headers, not in function definitions, in function calls, you can add a comma after the last parameter. So in PHP 7.2, you have a function call, and it looks like that, right? You just simply var dump test. That's a function call, right? You call a function, you have a parameter, that's it. What happens in 7.2 when you do this? What happens?
Error.
Well, obviously it will be an error because simply PHP 7.2 just simply won't support it. Syntax error, right? Because it's an unexpected closing parenthesis, it expects a new parameter. 7.3 to the rescue again, in order to make the function calls consistent with the array syntax, if you may. So in 7.3, if I put a comma next to it and I just call it, it will work.
I still think there should be an error.
It was a 19-1 voting, so
Let's talk about it.
yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah, well, what can I say? Let me put it this way: when you are deploying your code and when you are copy pasting, for example, from an array like values into a function call, then your code may break in 7.2.
My main argument for it is I sometimes sort my lines. This doesn't count for function calls, but it counts for arrays, so I love the trailing comma.
Yeah.
And also just adding parameters in Git. You don't have a deletion and an addition. Now
Yeah.
you just have one addition.
But you
Exactly
You
right.
shouldn't have it, right? This is an error in a lot of languages, right? We're discussing today work. This is an error in many languages.
Yeah. Well,
It's really useful for debugging. Like this happens all the time in debugging. You have a
But
link
because you have an
system.
error, they rank you.
so that being said, my take on this one, and this is slightly like this is usually personal, so take it with a pinch of salt, is that when they added this support, they should have added it to the function definitions and declarations as well, because then that would have been consistent. But currently it's not, so we just have yes, please.
You add another comma there.
That's right.
Oh.
Let's try what happens. Alrighty. What are the bets? What will happen?
If this is not an error, I'm getting out of here. I'm doing this JavaScript.
Obviously, it's a parse error. Yeah. All right.
At least it tells you what it's expected.
Yeah. At least. But actually, if you take a look at the error message, it's actually lying, because it's not expecting the parenthesis, because technically, how it looks like is that there is an unexpected comma, but technically it can easily happen that you miss the parameter. So it's not necessarily the valid error message. That being said, yeah, there are still some stuff to solve. Alrighty. So how many of you use Json encoding?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, nearly everyone, right? Because that's kind of what we all the time do. Alrighty. How does JSON encode behave? What are the possible return values of JSON encode? This is not an interview question, don't worry about that.
False
Just
to
asking.
all the encoded value.
So it either returns false, or returns true, or returns null, or returns an object or an associative array. All of these are valid values, right? Now, what does JSON encode or JSON decode returns when there's an error? What's not seen in
It
PHP?
doesn't throw an exception.
There's a constant
No.
check.
It returns null, right? Now the problem with that is that you have a JSON encode in 7.2, right? and you pass in a completely invalid JSON string. As you can see, because of the last two characters, it's a completely invalid JSON string. What will 7.2 do in this case? What will be the decoded JSON? Null. As we discussed, it really should be null, right? PHP JSON encode. It's a big fat null, as we expected. My problem is that actually null itself is a valid JSON. So let's say that I pass in the string null in full lowercase, which is a completely valid JSON payload. What will happen? Yes. So this is like a what talk, right? So thank you very much. How will I know if it actually errored out or not? What's the function? There are two functions for that. JSON lost error, JSON lost error message.
I think doesn't also has like a reference to JSON decode, which does it.
That's correct.
Exception, yeah.
That's correct. Now, again, 7.3 to the rescue. Only 6.5 years after it was raised as a bug. We have the option now to throw an exception. Can you imagine that? It will break so many people's code. Oh, it will be so great, right?
But it's not by default, so it won't actually break.
That's very true. It's not by default, but when you actually turn it on them. So how it looks like is that you have a JSON decode, and it's by default, if you call the same function the same way after upgrading, it will behave the same way. So no surprises there, really. Just a second. If I run PHP JSON encode, then obviously it will behave the same way. It will be null, right? Now, but if we tweak it just a little bit, and I will add, for example, a big fat false here, and then a 512 here, and then a JSON. Yes, because it's the fourth parameter. Like they couldn't have messed up the existing like call structure because you may rely on those parameters. Therefore, the fourth one will be JSON throw on error. Sorry, what was that?
Even PHP Storm doesn't know about it yet.
Yeah, it does not. It does not because there is no official PHP 7.3 support for. Yeah, in PHP Storm, yeah. So that being said, when we do this and we call the same function, then as you can see, suddenly you have an Encode JSON exception. What's the problem with that though? That it's in the global namespace. And many people in many old code bases will have a global JSON exception. I can guarantee that. So it won't be that easy to turn this on. But that being said, it's there, it can be caught, it can be properly handled now, but in each and every place where you have a raw JSON encode or JSON decode call in your code, you will have to update it at some point. But rest assured, at least the old stuff stays as is, pretty much.
Is this JSON exception a run extension or runtime exception?
The JSON exception is a runtime exception because, well, PHP doesn't have compiler, well, not in the traditional sense, so it can't be.
You can catch it.
And yeah, usually the issue, usually the type of exceptions that you can't catch or can hardly catch are like related to parsing or something like that. Yeah.
And what about JSON encode?
Same.
Okay.
Behaves exactly the same way. By default, it's just nulls and whatnot, and you turn it on the exact same way with the exact same constant. So yeah, that's that. Alrighty, and the last one that I would like to showcase with the code is around lists. So how many of you use the list call? List.
Occasionally.
Occasionally. Most of the time it's occasionally, rarely, and so on. And if your code is well structured, you really don't need it. But many people actually do, and many people rely on it. And there was one feature that was missing since the very beginning of lists implementation, namely that when you extract values into variables from an array with list, you weren't able to extract them into a pointer, like by reference, if you may. So you actually had to create a variable out of it, but that was a hard copy. of the array element, except if it was an object, obviously. But how it looks like is that you have the list code, right? And when you did this, then this is how it worked, right? That you had an array, and you wanted to extract literally the second one, and you wanted to override it, and then display the old array. What happened in these cases is that you still got back the old foobar array, right? So if I do a PHP, list PHP, you get foobar back, because technically what happened is that bar got copied into band, and irrespective of what you set here, the array stayed the same. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, what if I actually wanna do operation on the second element, but I don't wanna then copy it back to the array? I just wanna have it as a reference, if you may. This is what I would do in 7.2. Sorry. And then this should work, but actually, unfortunately, it does not. There is a fatal error. 7.3 actually solved this problem. So in 7.3, you can actually have references in list calls. And it will properly replace the given element in the array if you extract it as a reference. It's not a very often used feature, but there are systems where an extra assignment or some extra like convoluted variable passing around can be avoided if you are using this feature. Alrighty, so that's it for the code. Any questions so far before I move on? And
Szasza, you mentioned polyfill.
Yeah.
So given something like is countable,
Yep.
If you were keen to use that
Yep.
before you're ready to implement 7.3,
Yep.
it might be useful to just talk through steps that people would take in order to
Yeah.
pick their
And that's fair enough. Thank you very much for that. So how it looks like is that if you want to prepare your code for a future release, then what you usually do is that you go through the given features that get implemented in a given programming language version. And what you do is that you check for functions or objects or like whatever kind of like references that you can polyfill. A little bit like when you're polyfilling JavaScript for all browsers, right? Where a given feature is not available. It works exactly the same way with server-side code, that you just create a simple helper file, if you may. And for example, if you want to have isCountable already in your code so that your code will be ready for PHP 7.3, then you can just define an isCountable function, or you check if the function is defined, obviously. And if it's not, then you define a function, the isCountable function, which will contain the boilerplate for you, and you can retrofit your code already, even before PHP 7.3's release, to use the isCountable function. And then when PHP 7.3 gets released, no problem whatsoever. Big piece is here, so I will have to wrap up soon. So as soon as PHP 7.3 gets deployed onto your production servers or staging or whatever, the function will get defined, so the helper will turn off completely automatically. So that's kind of the high-level approach of how you can kind of polyfill, for example, a global function. Let's say. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, perfect. That's
Awesome. There was someone else around here with a hand up. No questions? No. Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
With the Json throwing the exceptions, are you able to like turn that on globally?
As far as my knowledge goes, currently not. Currently, it's not a global function. I need to check the source if they have added some kind of like compile time, like PHP function, but I can guarantee that the prepackaged PHPs will come with this feature turned off, even if it's possible to have it turned on. Because if they would turn this off by default, whoa, that would be
You can use the guzzle polyfill.
Yeah, you can use the guzzle polyfill, but the issue is that you would be surprised how many old systems still don't have even Composer. Plenty of them, unfortunately.
And also, you just break it by throwing an exception.
Also that. Alrighty, so just to wrap it up, because the piece is here. So what we were talking about was the new isCountable function, the more flexible here /new doc syntax, the trailing comma is allowed in function calls. exceptions can be turned on for a JSON d/encode calls, and assignment by reference and list calls. There is a sixth one, which currently has no visible result or no visible feature addition to PHP 7.3, namely that the PCRE library is upgraded to PCRE2, and PCRE2 comes pre-packaged with PHP 7.3. For people who don't know what PCRE is the regular expression matching library of PHP. So just to be aware of the fact that new flags and new feature switches will probably come in the preg match and whatever functions, just to be aware of that it can appear in future releases, and even in 7.3, who knows, it's half a year away. Also, the performance, at the very minimum, will stay the same, but in some cases, it will increase, because simply PCRE2 is much more advanced. That's pretty much it. That being said, there are some changes which are currently proposed. They have already passed voting and it's being implemented. There are pull requests already for that. That being said, there is a new operator coming up, which is the no coalescing assignment operator.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a double Elvis operator, right? It looks really cool. That being said, how it will work is that this is a binary operator. If left-hand side is null, then the value of the right-hand side will be assigned to the left-hand side. That's pretty much it, and it's already approved and it's already implemented. There is an open PR for that in the PHP source. So probably it will be coming in 7.3. When you are accessing an invalid container as an array, for example, if you try to access a binary value like a Boolean true false, you try to access that as an array. Right now, it just silently fails. How awesome that is, right? Like no warnings, no. I think there is maybe a notice, but I'm not sure about that. But now it will throw a warning, as it really should. There will be some set cookie functions. How many of you use cookies from PHP?
Not directly.
Okay, so you may not be that happy about the news, but currently, for example, when you do a set cookie function code that has like 8 parameters, roughly. The very first one is the cookie name, and the remaining 7 are the various like headers that you associate or parameters that you associate with the cookie. That being said, that will be collapsed into one array, so it will become like 2 parameters, which is not that bad. And also, it will support the same site flag, which is not even a proper RFC or proper standard in the browsers, but it will support it nonetheless. So, wrapping up, there are some resources which I very highly recommend to keep reading on a regular basis. The PHP supported versions, so you know how outdated your systems are. PHP RFCs, which are under voting, under implementation and whatnot, and the PHP source. Now, only read that if you can't sleep. Like, seriously? Not kidding there, the repo is like 300 megs. Like, that's a seriously massive stuff. So, Q&A. Any questions that I may or may not be able to answer?
You said voting was like 19-1?
No, actually it was I think 27-2 because I think there are 29 people voting or something like that.
How can someone become a voter?
So how it looks like is that I don't know how many of you are familiar with the PHP RFC voting system. So how it looks like is that there are some selected few who are the kind of core maintainers or core developers of the PHP language, and they are the main contributors to the PHP source or the PHP extensions as well. And how it looks like is that whenever you propose an RFC, anyone can propose an RFC. That's simple enough. There is a given structure that you need to follow when you propose one, and ideally you may already want to have a PR so that actually the voters can see what you are talking about, what are the use cases, and so on and so forth. PHP is written in C, so it won't be fun, I can guarantee you that. But that being said, when you are there and you created your RFC and you actually underpinned it properly, then it gets into a voting. First of all, you have to propose that which PHP version should it hit, because if it's a major change, then they may not want to release it in a minor version. And there is a voting, there is a pretty strict voting cycle, namely that since each and every minor version release is in early December or around early December, if something doesn't make it to the voting, I think by February or March, it won't meet the next version. Like, that's just not going to happen. It will have to wait a year. You create your RFC, they vote on it, they put your head on the chopping block for your PR changes, and if everything is fine, then your changes will get into PHP. That's pretty much it. And whenever there is an RFC, there must be a 2/3 majority. Otherwise, it's not like a 50+1, it's a 2/3 majority. Otherwise, it just won't go. Yep.
Do you know any like resources on how to contribute to PHP?
Everything is written in the repo. So if you open up the repo, then they have at least like 5 readmes, just in like the main like root directory. And there is a contributing.md, which is about 7 screens long. So yeah.
It's not just contributing; it's also like I personally don't know C, but yeah, like I'd be interested in looking into it. That's all.
Sure. Again, their repo is pretty descriptive, and actually they are more prescriptive than allowing. So you actually have to follow stuff, otherwise they will be like, no, we don't even talk to you.
Yeah.
Like sincerely, that's how they do it. Like that's their way of doing so.
So they don't have to deal with people just submitting RFCs that are completely useless.
Yeah, exactly right. By the way, there are multiple open pull requests. There are much more pull requests to the PHP repo than RFCs. So yeah, there is a lot of cluttering there.
That's good.
No, it means it's evolving, you know.
Yeah, it's evolving, and we can be sure that it will have new versions for many years to come. So yeah, that's that. Any more questions? Awesome. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Well, folks, once again, a big thanks to Szasza. It's great to actually go through that level of detail with upcoming releases. So very much appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.